I will start by saying that I am of a different vintage than the kids who are in your course. In college in the 90s, I think myself and my peers generally felt like we were not kids anymore, but not yet full adults. And it was accepted that we knew we would morph into adults just by doing the things, right? You would go, you would get your first apartment. If you didn't know how to do laundry, you'd figure it out the hard way. If you didn't know how to cook something, you'd figure it out the hard way. If you didn't understand you shouldn't eat raw eggs, you'd figure that out the hard way. The garbage stopped up, the bills became untenable, right? You say, quote, many newly minted adults are more educated than ever, yet more lost than ever, end quote. So my first question is, has this generation just lost its faith in its own ability to learn by doing?
I think that there's two answers to that. One of them is, yes, there's some truth to what you said, this concept of learned helplessness, right? That if a generation is more coddled than ever before, the parents were more helicopter parents, didn't let them take responsibility in real life and try things on their own, then it would lead to that result. This is a lot of what my former colleague, Jonathan Haidt, writes about. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. I also think there's truth to this concept of like, at the end of the day, most generations are essentially the same. We try to make a big show or a game out of like separating them into different segments, Gen Z, Gen X, whatever. And like mostly it's just made up. And so what I tried to do with the course that I taught and now the book that I wrote is teach the skills people would not necessarily learn otherwise. I don't write about, how to deal with the garbage, how to rent an apartment. These are all things I feel like you can learn relatively easily, like you said, through trial and error. There are other concepts, however, that I think are a lot harder to learn on your own and through research. And so I think that there are certain life skills that actually can be taught more like things are taught in school, where it's a curriculum that builds on itself.
What makes you a grown-up exactly? Paying your bills, managing your emotions, turning 21? Raffi Grinberg has some thoughts, which he taught in a popular course at Boston College called Adulting 101, and which he has now turned into a new book published last month entitled How to Be a Grown-Up, The 14 Essential Skills You Didn't Know You Needed Until Just Now. Raffi is a business leader, an author, an educator, and was co-founder of the Constructive Dialogue Institute alongside Jonathan Haidt. Raffi is interested in helping today's young adults build the confidence and the resilience required to be fully functional, as well as a hopefully satisfied grown-up. Because as a former career coach, he saw up close that while we have got tons of so-called highly trained adults graduating college these days, many of those newly minted grown-ups are more educated and more lost than ever. What sparked the creation of your course at Boston College, Adulting 101?
Part of it was informed by my own experience. So when I graduated from college, I started my first job, the first day of work. HR came in, give everyone forms to fill out, like what kind of tax elections do you want to do for your deductions? What kind of health insurance do you want to pick? I went in the hallway to call my parents and ask them, and everyone else was there too, because they were also calling their parents. It's like, how is it that we went to these supposedly elite universities, had higher education, working a good job, and like never learned? The second cause that sort of compounded all this was I started at Boston College not as a teacher, but rather as a career coach. And in my first appointments with students, I noticed this common trend of not only were they trying to prepare for an interview, but they didn't really know like what they were interviewing for, why they wanted it. They didn't know what careers were even out there. They felt like they didn't have marketable skills. They were pretty lost as to what they wanted out of life, period, because they'd spent the last 4 years in a bubble that's very different from the real world. And I felt like college was doing a massive disservice. This wasn't specific to BC, but rather the entire higher ed system was doing a massive disservice to students by not preparing them for the real world.
Well, but there was a shift there because I would argue in my generation, nobody was calling their parents because we were too embarrassed to call our parents. We thought, I'm not going to call my parents. I don't need nobody. I'll figure it out. And it was really a source of pride, right? We got it wrong half the time. Where did this shift come from? If you are the college career counselor, you're dealing with people who are in their 20s. This didn't happen when they were 22. It started far earlier, where it went from the assumption is I always call my parents to the assumption is I got to figure it out.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will reinforce what you said actually with another example. Like in the career counseling office, it was surprising how often my boss received phone calls from parents, right? Being like, you got to help my kid find a job. And
Gross.
she would say, to her credit, right? It's like it's their responsibility to be proactive. If they come to me, I'll help them. But again, I guess what I'm trying to say about the generations is I don't know if it's specific to a point in time. Like this generation is different from that generation. I think that they go through cycles over time. There's a lot of muddying between the arbitrary lines that we draw. At the same time, what I mentioned, I think is still true that like there was a period of time when people were being overparented. It's possible that trend's continuing. It's possible we're kind of at the peak of it and it's going to decline, hopefully. But that overparenting could lead to exactly what you described.
I believe the title of your book is misleading. It's How to Be a Grown Up. But as I was reading your book, I thought, shouldn't it be How to Be a Satisfied Grown Up? Because being a grown up just means staying out of jail, keeping a roof over your head. That's literally it, right? You can have no satisfying relationships. You can fail to live up to whatever your intellectual potential is. And you're still an adult. You're just an unpleasant adult, right?
Oh, I was going to say how to not be an unpleasant adult.
Right,
Could have been
right.
either. Yeah.
I feel like there could have been a subtitle where it's don't be a waste of space. That kind of.
Mhm. I like the edginess. I
Right.
think part of what I'm trying to do in a lot of ways with my message, which is this phase of life is different from the previous phase of life for you. So for some people, it's after high school. For some people, it's out of college. But it's a point where they're mostly, at least financially independent. They're working. They're living on their own, away from family. That phase of life. And I think it's really helpful actually to say this is the grown-up phase and it's different. And this is what I get into in the first chapter with the psychology of adult development. Psychologists actually do define a phase of life as adulthood, and it's distinct from childhood and adolescence. And in order to be an adult in this psychological sense, there's a maturity phase that needs to happen. And I think for a lot of people, it manifests as a quarter life crisis, which we can talk about. But I think in general, the quarter life crisis is a good thing and people should lean into it more.
I think it's so funny because people did use terms like quarter life crisis when I was about 25, which was 125 years ago. But I remember thinking it was a joke. Um, have you, by the way, ever read the book Infantilized by Keith Hayward?
No.
So I had him on my podcast. We spoke a couple months ago, and his book talks about the simultaneous infantilization of the individuals and social mores of our society, combined with the adultification of youth. He talks about how consumer culture and pop culture and advertising in particular glorifies the idea of staying young forever and staying unaccountable forever. And then he talks about how the lines have gotten blurred between adults and children, and the traditional sort of three phases of life, which were being an infant, where you can't take care of yourself, being an adolescent, where you can, but you're still learning, and being an adult, where you're responsible for yourself and others, have gotten blurred, and there's no respect for the third phase. And so it's no longer aspirational, right?
There's another parenting book I really like
Okay.
called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids.
Okay. But that
Bas-
has to be year two, because just at the point where they're getting like, we're about to potty train, then they have to be reminded to have more
to have
kids.
another one. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. But I think that the message of the book that I mentioned is basically that parenting matters a lot less than you think it does. So much of how people end up is based on genes and other things that you can't control as a parent. And
Yes.
so there might as well relinquish some of that control, feel a bit more free in your own household. And if you don't feel as much pressure or as much time pressure to raise your kids a certain way, then you're open to having more.
That's a good point. And it's good to have some spares, not just because one of them might die in the factory or on the farm, right?
Might have
One of
one of
them
them
might
might end
be
up,
weird.
totally a bad egg or whatever. So we're hedging our
Exactly.
bets with having multiple kids.
Well,
I
and
like the message that you said of infantilized. I think a lot of that resonates with me. I would say, in addition to that, something I've been thinking about is that in a lot of ways, society infantilizes people less than in the past, in the sense of giving them less direction. So I'd say in the old days, right, when you lived in more insular communities, you had much stronger sense of like top-down religion or even theocratic government back in the days of like monarchy, right? There were basically people telling you how to live a good life. And if you follow this playbook, you'll have a good life and you'll have meaning and purpose. And obviously it didn't work for everyone, but it did work for a lot of people. And nowadays, when I say nowadays, I mean specific to this time, specific to this country in the US, we have a lot more freedom, which I think is a objectively good thing. But more freedom comes with less direction. And it's very rare for society to be telling you, this is what a good life means. If you follow these rules, you will have meaning, you will have purpose. We don't have as much religion, we don't have as much government, et cetera, et cetera. And people have to figure it out for themselves. And so I agree with you in many senses, people are being infantilized, not being taught to take responsibility for themselves, for others. And at the same time, they're not being given a playbook of how to live their life. It just means there's more responsibility on the individual to figure it out for themselves, to figure out, what do I value? How much do I want to honor my past, like my parents, the religion I was born with, et cetera? How much do I want to
Culture, the
chart out a
norms.
path?
Yeah.
What is ultimately the life that I want to pursue? You have to make your own meaning because nobody's giving it to you on a silver platter anymore.
And there's too many competing forces for your attention, for your respect, for all of those things. It's sort of society's controlling us less. And as a
Consciously,
result,
but I think
consciously.
subconsciously more, right? We're
Right.
subconsciously, like you said, we're assimilating messages all the time. We're bombarded with information all day from the internet and social media. Everyone with an opinion is able to share that opinion and broadcast it to everyone. And so if you're
Unfortunately.
not careful with kind of how you protect your own psyche from the constant bombardment of information and
Yeah.
build your own worldview, your own way of seeing things, you're just going to become this big blob of like what everyone else thinks.
Big blob. We are all just a bunch of big blobs, but that's another podcast. I mean, I think that's why everybody is out here
I think
searching
that
for
could be the
meaning,
title. That could have been
right?
the title. We are all just big blobs.
That's why everyone's listening to podcasts. That's why people like me are talking to people like you. If you and I were next to each other at a dinner party, I'd want to have this conversation, right? And one of the questions I would ask, just to kind of continue on your Adulting 101 course at Boston College, is tell me the profile of the kids that opt into your class. Either maybe the profile of the kids that opt in or the the type of kid that goes in there and starts to challenge you. What types of personalities do you see in that class?
I taught it. The last time I taught the course, I think was 5 or 6 years ago. So things might have changed. To your point, maybe it's a new generation. I can only speak to the one that I interacted with. I was very impressed with the students in the class overall. I found them to just be very high quality students, high quality people. It's possible that it's because the description of the course attracted the more proactive type of person, right? And I was pleasantly surprised by how willing they were to go along with my kind of unorthodox pedagogical techniques to have them incorporate what they were learning into their own life. And
Yeah.
so with every lesson that I taught came an assignment, and the assignment was something you had to do in the real world. So we had a lesson on facing rejection. You had to go out and get rejected from something. We had a lesson on dating. You had to go out and ask someone on a date. We had a lesson on
Like a
retirement
human
accounts.
being in the real world.
Yeah, and the students would have to do these assignments and then write a reflection on them. Like 95, 99% of the time, like they would do it and take it seriously. Like they would want to do it. And I was just very pleasantly surprised by that. I thought there would be more pushback.
I love it. Plus, you probably started a couple of love connections that otherwise wouldn't have started because everyone just swipe, swipe, swipe
I think I'm
instead of.
responsible for one relationship that lasted and one breakup that occurred because the assignment was if you're in a relationship, you don't need to ask someone on a date, but you do need to have a conversation with your partner about what's going to happen after you graduate because these were all seniors who are
Oh,
about to graduate. And most of them wouldn't have these conversations, to the point about productivity, just like whatever happens, we'll see. But I was like, have a conversation with your partner. Like, do you want to stay together? Do you not want to stay together? Don't just leave them hanging. And so there was one breakup as a result of that.
I love that. I'm just going to assume that what happened was you saved some dude the heartbreak of getting a letter postmarked from Paris saying, "Me and Francois are meant to be. I'll never forget you." Um, So I think that's fantastic. And your book was organized into sections. You've got self, money, relationships, parental relationships, career. The very first life skill that you actually just mentioned, the very first life skill you cited was coping with rejection, which I love because if you just watch the movie Adolescence, that's the big problem, right? I mean, they've become fragile to a point where I'm terrified to leave my own house. Um, Rejection. Am I correct in assuming that rejection is harder for young people today? And if so, is it as simple as the result of parents who never really let them get rejected? Or do you think it's something bigger than that?
Yeah, I did name the chapter, I think it was like facing rejection, but really the skill is about building resilience. So resilience comes through practice. There's almost no other way to gain it. And that's why I gave my students that assignment of like, go out and get rejected because it's going to build that resilience. And I say that if I could have any superpower in the world, my superpower would be that I'm immune from rejection. I don't mind it at all. And if I had that superpower, I would try everything and I would apply to everything and I would try to make connections with everyone. It would be amazing. But myself, everyone in the world obviously feels that sting of rejection every time. No matter how resilient you are, it still hurts. right? And I think that there is a skill to be learned to further improve your resilience of how to overcome that like initial reaction, that initial feeling that you have, and talk back to yourself and be like, yes, it hurts. It feels like someone doesn't like me, or I'm not good enough. Okay, is that really true? Is it true that people don't like me? Is it true that I'm not good enough? And you can kind of have a more rational approach to talking back to yourself and saying, okay, at the end of the day, this rejection was painful, but it doesn't imply anything significant about me as a person, right? It's not ending the world, and I can keep trying. And if I keep trying, I'll have more success over time.
Some of the greatest entrepreneurs say things like, if you want to be good at being an entrepreneur, go out to a bar. Your assignment is to get someone to give you their number. The statistics are, 75% of women you ask out are going to say no. So go out to a bar, and before I'm going to invest in you, go out and keep asking people for their number. The purpose of the exercise is to try to get people to the point where they're not even immune to it, they're ready for it, right? They're like, I'm just assuming it's going to be a no, but it's a numbers game. Get that life is a numbers game. And it tends to be harder for women because we don't walk around asking people out a lot of the time. So I wonder what kind of differences you see between boys and girls, if any, in this course. But another life skill you cited was fighting automatic thoughts. To me, automatic thoughts just sounds like what we used to call spiraling back in my day. Again, spiraling has been around for as long as humans have been around. But it seems that the distance from frustration to thought spiral is far shorter than it ever was before for young adults. Why?
Well, you mentioned the
Or am I wrong?
spiraling has been around, no, for a long time. I think that's true. I also think the techniques to deal with it have been around for a long time. And so what I'm teaching in that chapter is essentially cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a relatively modern form of therapy, but it actually comes from Stoic philosophers and Buddhism, and all these philosophies have been around basically since the beginning of civilization, which is that what we immediately think, like our intuitive thoughts in response to something, are not always true. And you can talk back to those intuitive thoughts and try to have a more rational approach. The problem with, big problem with human behavior is that we tend to act on those initial emotions. So someone says something to me, I get insulted, and then I lash out. Instead of intercepting the process and being like, okay, is what they said to me truly insulting, right? Maybe they didn't mean to insult me, whatever it is. If you can intercept that before the emotion arises, and then before the behavior arises out of the emotion, you can change the way that you act. And it's not necessarily difficult. Everyone does this a million times a day, right? You're overriding your natural instincts that, whatever evolution is programmed into you to just like eat as much as you can and whatever it is, you're overriding that all the time. But I think that level of self-control when it comes to your mental habits is something we tend to teach less, and doesn't come automatically with adulthood the same way that, not eating sweets all day comes with graduating from childhood.
All of the tools that you are citing are tools that we as adults use all the time. But they're also tools that none of us perfect, because if we did, we'd all get along super well with our bosses and our ex-spouses and our children. I mean, like this, you know what I mean? Like what you're talking about is just kind of getting life right. So it's a journey for everyone. And I wonder, which of the adulting tools in your course do young people have the biggest problem with? Or I should say, which of the adulting tools in your course do young people feel the most challenging? Right?
I think the ones around relationships are the most challenging. It's least intuitive. Right. The things about relationships, especially dating, I think are counterintuitive, because a big part of my message is to treat it proactively. The same way that you would treat taking control of your financial situation, your career, putting it in your own hands. People have a different approach to dating that's more like magically. I'm just supposed to lock eyes with my soulmate from across the room somewhere, and then I'll fall into it. And what's interesting is that the vast majority of people say that eventually they want to get married, or at least end up with a long-term partner. And yet in the moment, they're doing nothing to make that happen. So out of all the topics I taught, I thought that's where there was the greatest cognitive dissonance. Like, I say I want to end up with a long-term partner, but right now I'm not doing that. And the attitude of right now I'm not doing it might make sense when you're like 16, right? Maybe you feel it's too young to enter a serious relationship. But by the time students are graduating college, they're 21, 22, 23. And I think the problem is you might get lucky, and the first person you date seriously, you were meant for each other, and that's great. I happened to get that lucky. So, I was fortunate. But for most people, it doesn't happen. It takes a lot of trial and error. And if you say that you want to be married by the time you're 30 or whatever arbitrary deadline you set, it may not happen if you just spend your entire 20s kind of intentionally shunning long-term relationships. The flip side of this that I try to clarify as well is it's not that you need to make every date you have into a serious relationship. I'm ultimately trying to find my life partner. And this person, I'm going to go out with them because I think there's a possibility that's true. and I'm going to keep dating them until I've realized that possibility is not true. And then we'll stop, and then I'll try someone else.
Because we're so good at taking our emotions out of it and breaking up with people who are bad for us.
Well, to your point, right? So probably the hardest thing to actually put into practice, right? Of course, human beings are not robots, and you can't always treat this as a numbers game. For the most part, I think that the central message of just to treat your relationships with the same amount of proactivity that you're treating everything else in your life is key and hard to enact.
Being intentional is, it's not a phrase we use, right? When we think about looking for jobs, when we think about these things. No parent that I know who has kids who are getting ready to apply to college is saying, be intentional about what this college means for you. What they're saying is, where do you want to go?
No, parents should definitely do more of that when kids are deciding to go to college. Like the expectation is while you're dependent on your parents, they have your long-term best interests at heart, and they're going to help you make decisions, that steer you in that direction. They may not always get it right, but that's what they're trying to do. And then when you're an adult, the definition of being a grown-up or an adult is that you're responsible for your own long-term happiness or success. And so you can't rely on your parents' judgment. You can't rely on anyone's judgment. You have to get information, get opinions, synthesize it, and make your own choices. So I think it might be a little bit too much to expect a 17 or 18-year-old to be that intentional of like, is college the right decision for me? I think it might make sense for them to rely on their parents. And it would make sense for them to rely on it less when they're 22 and be more intentional about making their choices when they reach that life stage. But now, to your point, like college is kind of an extension of adolescence.
Right. Because typically in my day, in high school, you learned how to drive, you learned how to cook something, and you had a job, even if it was just a summer job. One of the things you point out on relationships, because you say that that's the area that the young people these days are most challenged with, which makes sense. One of the things you point out about relationships in the book is how to have sort of civil, non-passive aggressive conversation. Do you think kids are not learning that these days because it's not being modeled in their households, in their schools, online? Do you think we've just become too careful in the way that we speak with each other?
Yeah, careful might be a loaded term, but the ultimate style of communication that I think is most productive is assertiveness. Assertiveness just means I have the right to share my own opinions and to share my own needs, and you have the right to ignore them. As opposed to aggressiveness. Aggressiveness is I have the right to share my needs and opinions, and you have to accommodate them, right? My way or the highway. And passiveness is I don't have the right to share my own opinions and needs. That would be imposing on someone to just share what. So the problem, if you have passive communicators is that you don't really know what they're thinking, what they need. And actually what happens over time is they build up resentment until it kind of explodes in an aggressive outburst. With aggressive people, of course, the problem is they're trampling on other people. Passive aggressiveness is the worst of both worlds. It's you're aggressive, but you're trying to come across as passive. Assertiveness is just a direct style. And of course, it's hard, right? Everyone kind of aspires this communication. It's harder in practice than in theory.
For sure. But there's the rub. I always term it being direct. And in my 40s, I have found so many people complimenting me for being direct. And it's really disheartening because I'm not obnoxious. I will just say, it was nice to meet you. I had a nice time. Somehow I feel like this is not exactly a fit. Wouldn't want to waste your time or mine. Thanks for the invite. I don't want a second date. That to me is, I'm not a jerk, but I'm direct, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the number of responses that I get saying, wow, well, I disagree, but I love that you're that direct. You're great. I hope you find your person. People are so hungry for direct.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of why I'm trying to teach that skill. I do think it is a skill. It doesn't necessarily come naturally unless you happen to have really good role models who are great communicators.
It's funny because I just see it as not being a jerk. I mean, if I'm not managing your expectation of what I'm going to do or not do, then I'm a jerk because your time matters is the way I've framed it in my mind.
I think the reason that some people nowadays may not see it that way is I think they feel a lot of responsibility for other people's emotions. And I think the key realization is you're not responsible for other people's emotions. You're responsible for how you conduct yourself. Like you said, don't be a jerk. Don't phrase it in a rude way, right? But as long as you're doing that, you're not responsible for how they feel. They are.
Right, right. As a professor working in a college environment, I'm sure you have people come to you and confess things and tell you things and vent their frustrations. What are young people today most worried about? What are they asking for from you that maybe their parents should know?
I should first clarify for the record, I wasn't a professor. I was a lecturer.
To me,
And
it's the
now
same thing, but I get
I
there's a
run an
difference.
organization and I have a lot of young employees. And I will say it's something similar, right? Where it's like sometimes, at least in the early days, people would come to me with these kind of like personal issues, dilemmas. And I think both as a teacher and as a boss, it's nice to care about your people, right? Your students, your employees, and to be invested in their lives and that they feel comfortable sharing those things with you and seek your guidance. Also, I think it's helpful to have some boundaries, special boundaries,
Right.
and to play a role in their life that's more like a mentor and less like a parent.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I'm constantly trying to both get closer to my employees. I think that closeness is a good thing, but also set that like healthy amount of distance of like, I'm not your parent, I'm your boss. And at the end of the day, part of me wants what's best for you, and part of me wants to do the job of the organization and just get you to do your job. And those two things are in a kind of productive tension with each other. And I think most people intuitively get that. This isn't a problem a lot of the time. But I think nowadays, to your point about people being more coddled, overparented, et cetera, when they get to the workplace, they just went from the mode of my parents were my parent to my professor was my parent to my boss is my parent. And it's really bad if you see your boss as a parent because you might have a boss who's less nice than me and they don't care about what's best for you. They're just trying to squeeze more work out of you or, whatever it is.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I have had a couple of situations where someone's working for me and asking me questions that seem almost childlike. And I'm thinking, God, I would have rather eaten my own shoe than spoken in such an incapable way to my boss at your age. Like, I can't say that to
Yeah,
you.
I think it's a difference in how they see the relationship, right? If they saw the relationship the same way you did, they would also feel embarrassed. But if they see it as like, oh, now my boss is responsible for my happiness, then it feels natural to them that they would ask you to make them happy or whatever it is they need from you.
It makes my brain explode. Let's talk a little bit about people's relationship with their parents. Do you think 20 somethings today feel more tension with their parents than in prior generations?
Not sure about prior generations, but I do think that every parent-child relationship has to go through this transition of when the child becomes an adult. We talked about half of it already, the half of it of the child taking more responsibility for their own happiness and so forth. But the other half of the equation is the parent and the parent being able to let go. And letting go doesn't mean not seeing your child anymore, not talking to them. What it means is you're no longer in charge of their own life. They're in charge of their own life. And they might make choices that you disagree with. And that's not only is that okay, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. The whole point of having children is of more people in the world, and those people make their own life choices and live different lives. It's kind of like a free market of like life that competes with each other. And if you had children, they were all exactly the same as you wouldn't necessarily be contributing that kind of diversity to the world. But that transition I've noticed is very hard for grown-ups to go through. Grown-up parents. I can imagine it'll be hard for me too, right? Your child can be very grateful that you raised them, you made sacrifices and so forth, and even be grateful for the advice that you just gave them. But being grateful for the advice doesn't mean that they have to follow it.
It's really funny that you describe it that way because I have a 5-year-old daughter. And lately she likes to say to me, I want to be like you when I grow up. And I always say, well, way to set the bar low, right? Like, that's not, you can do far better than that, Because she's saying it in a very sweet way. But my instinct is like, what? What? No, that's all you're going to aim for? You just think I have it together because I keep the vegetables coming and I keep your laundry clean. How do you recommend that a young adult clarify or signal or demonstrate to their parents that they feel they've reached a stage of adulthood where the relationship should be different?
I'm glad you asked. This is exactly the assignment I gave my students, was to have a talk with your parents about this. The same way that I said, right? If you're planning to not stay with your, boyfriend, girlfriend after college, like talk to them about it. With your parents, have an explicit conversation where you say, I'm a grown up now and I'm going to make my own choices. So I call this the DTR, the define the relationship conversation with parents. And I have an outline for this that I have in the book of kind of how to follow the conversation in a way that's going to get people to open up and not close it, right? The risk of approaching this the wrong way is it can strain the relationship more than it heals it. But I think if you follow the right playbook and come in with an open mind and curiosity and ask the right questions, again, I give outlines and examples of, then it really strengthens the relationship.
DTR with your parents. How do you describe or how do you outline the DTR for the romantic relationship in this book?
I don't do it for the romantic relationships. I think that's another one where it's like, if you kind of have the basic understanding of all this stuff, you can figure that one out for yourself. The one with your parents, I'd say, is a lot less common. It's less of like a normal thing that people go through unless they explicitly make it a point to do that. And that's why I provide more of the framework for it.
I love that, though. Finding the relationship with your parents. Who would have thunk it?
I think
Now,
one of the
I'm
inspirations for this,
47. Am I too old to define my relationship with my parents?
definitely not. Just like define the relationship with your romantic partner. It's not a one-time thing, right? presumably you could do this every so often. And I recommend it around this time of the transition to independence, but doing it often can't hurt either.
Should I do it again in the transition to menopause? Is that good timing? Like once right out of
Exactly. Hey,
college?
mom, dad, I just want to let you know
All
I'm
right.
in menopause.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to FaceTime you in, and I'm going to tell my parents we need to define the relationship. And my prediction is you're going to watch them smile, look at each other, and then they're going to pat me on the head, and they're just going to say, whatever, we're taking the kids out for ice cream. They take my kids out of the room. And then I'm going to be fine with it. But at
Yeah,
least you get some
it's
entertainment.
very possible you have a good relationship with your parents, right? And the status quo works. In a lot of cases, the status quo works. But I think that what you just gave is an emblematic example of how most of their people just live life on autopilot. Like the status quo is what's meant to be, and we just kind of keep it going. And again, that might be fine a lot of the time. Some of your relationships might be really good, or you might be really happy in your job, and you don't have to question them. But a lot of times it can be really dangerous to leave a life that's that unexamined, because then you're just living on autopilot. You're not making choices for yourself, and you end up living a life that you never chose.
The next phase is it's like adulting one up, how to be a grown up, and then how to be an old person, right?
Well, I think there might be a missing phase because you mentioned taking responsibility for yourself and for other people. And I think that those two might get squeezed together too often, right? Of like, you first have to figure out how to take responsibility for your own life. Then you can figure out how to take responsibility for at least caring for the people around you. And then once we're through that phase, right, then maybe it's old age. And I think a big part of that is accepting death, accepting that death is going to happen and being, I guess, at peace with your own mortality. Because another
And
phase
with the
transition, a
choices
lot
you
of
made
people,
so far.
that too. A lot of people never make peace with that kind of thing. And I feel like in a lot of ways, their fear of death, that's subconscious, is a negative motivator throughout their whole life, right? It causes you to
Ruins
make
their
decisions
living.
that are based out of fear.
Have you watched White Lotus?
I've seen one episode on
Like
an airplane.
because
My
of all the
impression from
murder?
that episode and my impression from reading reviews of it is that it's nihilistic. It has just a negative outlook on life and on people.
There is a moment where a woman who's on a girls' trip with her friends, all of whom are really kind of picking at each other, and difficult women who've known each other for probably 30 years, um, has a moment of honesty at the dinner table. And she basically talks about, at the end of the day, we started life together. We went in different directions. And we may not be going through life together now, but I look at your faces and I think I'm at that point in life where I have to admit to the choices I've made and be okay with that and the repercussions of all of it. And that's kind of the thing of midlife. And so what she says is being around you makes me grateful that at least I have people to mark time with. It's very deep, actually. There are these moments of depth in an otherwise very frustrating, series full of very annoying people you wouldn't want to have dinner with. But there are moments of clarity where they show what it means to grow, right? To grow older, to go through all the phases. And I think part of what your book is trying to do is show that it's something positive, right? It's not just a task that's required. You will be happier if you learn how to be a grown up.
Well, it's the whole thing. It's going to happen to you whether or not you want it. I mean, it's life. And so if you don't seize it for yourself, it will be consumed passively. And I don't think anyone ultimately wants that. Your point about marking time made me think about Viktor Frankl. Did you ever read Man's Search for Meaning?
No.
So the first half of the book, I think, is the most famous part, his memoir of surviving concentration camp and the Holocaust and how he got through it and found meaning. The second half of the book, I think, is even better. It's about his a form of therapy that he created, or invented, called logotherapy, which is like purpose-based therapy. And there's one part where he's talking to someone who's aging and is really struggling with this process of aging, and he's not young anymore and has less time left and so forth. And what Frankl says to the patient is like, I would much rather be older than younger. When you're younger, there's so much uncertainty and anxiety about the future. You don't know what's going to happen to you. And now that you're in your latter phase of life, you already know what's happened. There's less uncertainty. And every single day that you've lived is a day that nobody can take away from you.
There's a comfort in that. Because you're not sort of subject to the whims of the world anymore. You're not subject to what's going to happen.
And so I think what Frankl is getting at and what he said to that patient is like, that time that you've lived has meaning because life intrinsically has meaning and it's existed. You should be proud that it existed, satisfied with it, etc. And not so worried about how much time is left, how much more can I do? The things you've done have already happened. And like that has meaning.
Last question. Assuming someone has not read your book and has not taken your course, but comes across this podcast or one of these clips, and they are nervous about how to be a grown-up. They're nervous about this transition in this life phase. What is your one piece of advice?
I guess I would say good. If you weren't nervous, you wouldn't be human, or you wouldn't be treating it with the sort of gravity that it requires. It's not like a pathological thing to be worried about the future, especially when you're young and so much of it is as of yet not set in stone. And that comes with it opportunity and excitement, right? The benefit of being young is you still get to shape all these things. You still get to make these choices. And you can already know now, not all the choices are going to work out perfectly, and your life is going to end up the way it might in a dream that you've created for yourself. But the choices you make will be your own as long as you're taking them seriously. And there's so many things that you can pursue and can do. And as long as you treat all that with the right level of intention, you're going to make meaning out of your life.